What's up, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of Chingron. Folks, it is a sad, sad day for America. Democracy and freedom of speech are once again under assault by the Trump regime. In the last few days, Orange Man signed an executive order which prevents social media corporations from silencing conservative points of view. He has opened the floodgates for YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter to be held liable for the content posted to their platforms, which would effectively bankrupt them. Let me explain how this works and why Trump did it. Currently, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter operate as public forums, meaning that you and I can post any content we want and they cannot be held liable for it. They host the material, but ultimately, the person who uploaded it is responsible. For example, the cartoon goat you see on my videos, I stole that. Is it copyrighted? I really don't know. But if it is, I can get sued for copyright infringement while Google's hands are clean. And this protection from liability is essential to the business model of all social media companies. Without it, they would be getting sued left and right because of people like me constantly uploading copyrighted material. In order for these companies to receive this liability exemption, they must follow certain guidelines. Namely, they are not allowed to curate or censor the content being uploaded to their platforms. If they are truly a public forum, then everyone should have an equal voice. However, if the company does attempt to silence specific individuals or suppress certain ideas, then they are acting as a publisher and not a public forum. And as a publisher, they become liable for the content posted to their platform. Now keep in mind, these rules were put in place for very good reason. They prevent companies from gaming the system, from double dipping, benefiting from the legal protections of being a public forum while simultaneously acting as a publisher who curates their content. Without these rules, the social media corporations could have their cake and eat it too. There are, however, exceptions to these guidelines. Specifically, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act states that public forums such as YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter can, in good faith, remove content deemed to be obscene or offensive. And this, my friends, this beautiful loophole is what gives us and our liberal allies within the social media corporations the legal authority to subjectively silence the alt-right. And not just the alt-right, even moderate conservatives, such as Steven Crowder, a bigoted Canadian who was rightfully demonetized by YouTube for making fun of a homosexual Latino activist. Some people might argue that demonetizing or deplatforming moderate conservatives is a form of censorship. And I'm not gonna lie, it is. It is total censorship. But if we are ever going to achieve our socialist, globalist dream, then the moderate right must be silenced. And don't get me wrong, as a patriotic American, as a progressive, I fully support freedom of speech, but only if it is speech which coincides with our liberal values. As liberals, we find conservative speech to be offensive, and so we are perfectly justified in suppressing it because we are right and they are wrong. But more importantly, we are silencing conservatives in good faith, which is completely in accordance with Section 230. And since progressives control all social media in America, this loophole works entirely to our benefit. We get to dictate what is acceptable speech and what is not. We get to have our cake and eat it too. God bless America. Unfortunately, our social media overlords really dropped the ball in the last election. They freely allowed conservatives to spew their bigoted, racist hate speech all over YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And they didn't do anything to stop it because they thought Hillary had it in the bag, as we all did. But somehow, the messaging of the alt-right anti-globalists got through. They, along with Russia, managed to brainwash our uneducated peasant class in the flyover states. Thankfully, our social media corporations are determined not to make the same mistake again. They have really upped their game this election cycle, demonetizing, restricting, and outright banning conservative content. Naturally, the right-wingers are outraged, preaching about censorship and their First Amendment rights. What they don't seem to understand, however, is that all conservative speech is hate speech. When a conservative talks about fiscal responsibility, they are really talking about racism. When a conservative talks about limited government, they're actually talking about sexism. And when a conservative talks about family values, don't kid yourself, folks, they're talking about building a wall. Granted, I've never spoken to a conservative, so I don't know if anything I'm saying is actually true. But I choose to believe because Don Lemon and Rachel Maddow told me to believe. And since they were right about the Russian collusion hoax, they must be right about this. At the forefront of this battle against conservative speech is Twitter. Jack Dorsey, my personal hero, finally decided to start putting fact-check links on Trump's tweets. And so, when Trump tweeted out that mail-in ballots would result in voter fraud, Mr. Dorsey immediately slapped him with a fact-check warning, implying that Trump's statement was false. And this, my friends, is what provoked Trump into signing the executive order which strips away the liability exemptions which has enabled our social media overlords to have their cake and eat it too. Now, granted, there is in fact ample evidence which suggests that mail-in ballots can and does result in voter fraud, especially if it were implemented nationwide. I mean, come on, anyone with a shred of common sense can come to that conclusion on their own. But forget about that. It doesn't matter. Us progressives also control the fact-checking organizations, which means we can label anything that Trump says as a lie, even when he's telling the truth. And believe me, this is a good thing. If we are to ensure victory in the next election, we must engage in a massive disinformation campaign, because telling the truth would be absolutely devastating to our cause. I mean, imagine if the black community were to find out that Trump's policies have been far more beneficial to them than any of Obama's or Clinton's. We'd be totally fucked. Thankfully, our liberal comrades in the mainstream media will never let this happen. In fact, let's take a look at what CNN has to say about this whole Twitter fiasco. Trump signs executive order targeting social media companies. On Tuesday, Twitter applied a fact check to 2 of Trump's tweets, including one that claimed, without evidence, that mail-in ballots would lead to widespread voter fraud. Notice the short caveat placed inside that sentence, without evidence. This is absolutely brilliant. Brilliant because it is technically true. Trump didn't provide any evidence within the tweet. But the real purpose of that little snippet is to insinuate that Trump's tweet is false. Folks, this is disinformation at its finest. It is lying without lying. CNN, I tilt my hat to you. Then, if we go a little deeper in the article, we have this gem. The president made the decision to warn Twitter despite the fact that the company and most other prominent social media platforms have allowed him and his associates to peddle unsubstantiated conspiracy theories with few constraints. Pay attention to the language here. Allowed him and his associates to peddle unsubstantiated conspiracy theories with few constraints. It's beautiful. And I want to be clear, this is not an opinion piece. This is a straight news article. But CNN has such disdain for Trump, they can't help but put their liberal bias on full display. Then, in the very same paragraph, they go on to defend Twitter's actions by stating that although they placed a fact-check warning on one of Trump's unsubstantiated tweets, they chose not to do so on another. Now, why is that relevant? Because it's a clear and open admission that Twitter is, in fact, subjectively deciding what is acceptable speech and what is not. Fuck, brilliant. And how do we get away with it? Because Section 230 allows us to do it as long as we claim it's in good faith. Will Twitter ever fact-check Adam Schiff? How about Nancy Pelosi? Or Joe Biden? Of course not. These people are our allies, and their unsubstantiated disinformation is for the greater good. I mean, the reality of the situation is that Trump's executive order is actually meant to protect free speech by forcing social media corporations to abide by the guidelines laid out in Section 230. And our mainstream media allies are having none of it. In truly heroic and patriotic fashion, they are openly supporting censorship of moderate conservatives because their values don't align with ours. But it doesn't stop there. How about our BBC allies across the pond? What's their take on the situation? Trump to sign executive order about social media. What sparked the latest row? The long-running dispute between Mr. Trump and social media companies flared up again on Tuesday, when two of his posts were given a fact-check label by Twitter for the first time. He had tweeted, "Without providing evidence, there is no way, zero, that mail-in ballots will be anything less than substantially fraudulent." Fantastic. Without providing evidence. They're in perfect unison with CNN. What's great about this is that BBC is a taxpayer-funded national news source for the UK. It's the equivalent of our PBS. If anyone is supposed to be impartial, it's the BBC. And yet, even they are under the control of us progressives. It makes you wonder what conservative Brits think about their taxpayer pounds being used to support our liberal propaganda. Who cares? This, my friends, is our global disinformation machine. This is how we will defeat Donald Trump in the next election. And this is how we will enact our socialist revolution and get back on a path towards globalization and enriching the Chinese Communist Party. And that's all I got to say. This is Chingron, signing out. If you enjoyed this video, then please like and subscribe. And until next time.